Before the 17th Amendment, under the original provisions of the Constitution, senators were elected by state legislatures. This was intended to ensure that the federal government contained representatives of the states and also to provide a body not dependent on popular support that could afford to take a more detached view of issues coming before Congress. However, over time, various perceived issues with these provisions, such as the risk of corruption and the potential for electoral deadlocks, or a lack of representation should a seat become vacant, led to a campaign for reform. The framers believed that in electing senators, state legislatures would cement their tie with the national government, which would increase the chances for ratifying the Constitution. They also expected that senators elected by state legislatures would be able to concentrate on the business at hand, without pressure from the populace. This process seemed to work well until the mid-1850s. At that time, growing hostilities in various states resulted in vacant Senate seats. The corruption of politics. In terms of corruption, the general feeling was that the senatorial elections were bought and sold, changing hands for favors and sums of money rather than because of the competence of the candidate. Between 1857 and 1900, the Senate investigated 3 elections over corruption. In 1900, William A. Clark had his election voided after the Senate concluded that he had bought votes in the Montana legislature. However, Todd Zwicky believed this concern was largely unfounded. There were dearths of hard information on the subject, and in over a century of elections, only 10 were contested with allegations of impropriety. Electoral deadlocks were another issue. Because state legislatures were charged with deciding who to appoint as senators, the system relied on them being able to agree. Some states could not and thus delayed sending representatives to Congress. In a few cases, the system broke down to the point where states completely lacked representation. Before 1891 and 1905, 46 elections were deadlocked in 20 different states. In one extreme example, a Senate seat for Delaware went unfilled for 4 years. In Indiana, also the conflict between Democrats in the southern half of the state and the emerging Republican Party in the northern half prevented the election of any candidate, therefore leaving the Senate seat vacant for 2 years. What the people needed. Some reformers saw the corruption. William Jennings Bryan, one reformer, argued for popular elections through highlighting perceived flaws with the existing system, specifically corruption and electoral deadlocks, and through arousing populist sentiment. Luckily, the 17th Amendment was created. Though there were not any related Supreme Courts, since no state had tried to appoint a senator instead of following the direct election method, by 1912, 239 political parties at both the state and national level had pledged some form of direct election. To avoid a runaway convention, in which unexpected or damaging amendments could be considered, the proposal to mandate direct elections for the Senate was finally introduced in the Congress. By April 8, 1913, the proposed amendment had been ratified by 3/4 of the states, adding it to the Constitution. On May 31, 1913, during the Progressive Era, Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan declared the amendment to be adopted. It amends Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution to provide for the direct elections of senators by the people of a state rather than their elections or appointment by a state legislature, thus effectively eliminating state representation in Congress. The 17th Amendment states that the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. The electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislatures. Although there were people who supported the 17th Amendment, there were also critics of the 17th Amendment as well. States complained that their power to influence the federal government was taken away by the federal government. They could no longer have their interests represented in the legislature. Therefore, the following states did not ratify the 17th Amendment: Utah, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Mississippi, Rhode Island, South Carolina, and Virginia. After the 17th Amendment was passed, there were effects and impacts the 17th Amendment had on the United States. During the Gilded Age, monopolies could no longer secretly control the U.S. Senate by corrupting state legislatures. For example, political machines. With direct election, each vote represented equally. The Democrats also retained control of the Senate.